The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the war-torn city. The sounds of explosions and laser fire filled the air, echoing through the smoke-filled streets. Human soldiers and Zalari warriors clashed, their fight a battle for survival, a war that seemed endless. But among the chaos, one man did not see his enemy, only the injured. Aaron Hale was a medic, trained to save lives, no matter the cost. It was easy for others to think of the Zalari as enemies, but for Aaron, the injuries he saw on the battlefield were all the same: pain, suffering, and fear. He didn't have time to consider who was a friend and who was a foe. He only saw people in need of help. He moved quickly through the smoke, ducking behind fallen debris and avoiding fire from both sides. His medic's kit was strapped to his back, and his heart raced with each step he took. The battlefield was a deadly place, and while the soldiers fought, he was the one who kept the wounded alive. The smell of blood and burnt metal was suffocating, but he didn't mind it. He was used to it by now. He had been here for hours, running from one injured soldier to the next, performing life-saving procedures with steady hands. His mission was simple: save as many as he could. His orders were clear, but even in the midst of all the chaos, his mind couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something big was coming. The Zalari forces had been pushing forward relentlessly, and the humans were holding their ground. It was only a matter of time before everything escalated. And in moments like this, Aaron could feel that tension building in the air. As he rounded a corner, he heard a cry, a desperate, pain-filled scream that echoed over the sounds of battle. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the noise. His heart was racing, his eyes scanning the area for the source. There, near the wreckage of a destroyed transport, he saw a figure, someone pinned beneath the twisted metal. Aaron's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her. The woman under the wreckage wasn't just any soldier. It was Princess Solara, the daughter of the Zalari king. She was known throughout the galaxy for her defiant spirit, a fierce fighter who had become a symbol of resistance against the humans. Her name was spoken in whispers, and stories of her strength and leadership had spread far and wide. She was the last person Aaron ever thought he would be saving. But now, here she was, lying unconscious beneath the wreckage of her transport, bleeding and helpless. The Zalari princess, who had led countless missions against the humans, was lying at his feet, unable to defend herself. Aaron didn't hesitate. Despite their past battles, despite everything that had happened between their people, he knew what he had to do. She was injured. She needed help. And for a medic, that meant only one thing: save her. He knelt beside her, trying to assess her condition. Her once pristine armor was torn and battered, her face bloodied, and her breathing shallow. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with rage and fear as she saw him hovering above her. You're a human," she spat, her voice filled with disgust and pain. Aaron met her glare but didn't respond. There was no time for words now. He checked her pulse, noting how weak it was. She was in bad shape, severe internal bleeding, a few broken ribs, and probably a concussion. But she was alive. And for now, that was all that mattered. "You're not dying today," Aaron muttered under his breath as he began working quickly, removing debris from her body to give her more space to breathe. Her eyes never left him, burning with hatred, but he ignored it. He reached into his medic kit and pulled out a painkiller injector, pushing it into her arm before she could protest. "Stay still," he told her. "This will help." The princess glared at him. "I don't need your help," she snarled, trying to push herself away from him. But her body was too weak, and she collapsed back onto the ground. "I'm not asking for your opinion," Aaron said, his voice firm. He worked quickly, making sure her injuries were stabilized. It wasn't easy, especially with the distant sounds of explosions and gunfire echoing through the city. But Aaron didn't let anything distract him. He had to save her. With a final push, he was able to lift her from the wreckage. She weighed much more than he expected, but he managed to get her onto his shoulder. Her body was limp, and her breathing was shallow, but she was still alive. Aaron ran, dodging fire from both sides, but his focus was solely on her. His mind raced as he pushed forward. The evac zone was close. He could see it in the distance, but he wasn't sure how long she would last. The journey was too dangerous. He didn't know if they could make it. He could feel her body getting heavier in his arms, and the sounds of the battlefield seemed to grow louder with each step. "Don't you dare pass out on me now," he muttered under his breath, urging himself forward. He wasn't sure if she could hear him. But he needed her to stay conscious, to keep fighting. When they finally reached the evac zone, Aaron collapsed, his arms trembling from the weight of the princess. He laid her gently on the ground and began working to stabilize her injuries further. His mind was racing. This was Princess Solara, the daughter of the king, and here she was, lying before him as he worked to keep her alive. She was still unconscious, her face pale and sweaty, but the painkiller had started to take effect. He felt her pulse steadying, and slowly her breathing became more regular. She was going to make it. Aaron didn't know what would happen next. Would the auxiliary forces come for him? Would they try to take him as a prisoner? Or worse, would they kill him for saving her? But for now, none of that mattered. The princess was alive, and that was all he could focus on. His job wasn't done yet. He still had to make sure she was safe. The sounds of the battle were still raging in the distance, and though they were now in a temporary haven, the war wasn't over. But Aaron knew something else. His world had just changed forever. Hours passed, and the painkiller finally started to take effect on Princess Solara. Aaron stayed by her side the entire time, watching over her, ensuring she didn't slip into unconsciousness again. The medic in him kept him focused. He had saved many lives on this battlefield, but none had ever been as high profile as hers. She was more than just an injured soldier. She was the daughter of the Zalari king, a symbol of defiance to humanity. And yet, here she was, vulnerable and weak in his care. The evac zone wasn't the safest place. It was a temporary refuge, hidden in the remains of a bombed-out building. There were few medics in this area, and even fewer soldiers who weren't preoccupied with their own survival. But Aaron knew that if anyone found out who Solara was, it could bring more danger. Despite everything, he couldn't help but wonder if the moment he healed her, the consequences would come crashing down on him. Would her people thank him for saving her life, or would they see him as a traitor? He checked on her again. Her breathing had steadied, and her pulse was more regular. The princess was still unconscious, her face pale from blood loss. Her eyes fluttered every now and then, but she remained unconscious for the most part. Her breathing was the only sound that filled the room as Aaron worked quickly to keep her alive. He couldn't afford to rest. Not now. Not yet. As time passed, Aaron began to take stock of his surroundings. The sounds of war were still close, the distant explosions shaking the walls around them. The war had not stopped for one moment, and there was no guarantee that it would stop anytime soon. Both sides of the conflict had been at it for years, and while there were moments of peace, they were always short-lived. Even now, the tension was thick in the air, and it was only a matter of time before the fighting came closer to their position. Aaron couldn't help but think of the weight of the decision he had made. Saving Solara wasn't something he had planned. There were so many reasons he could have walked away and left her to die. She was an enemy after all. She was part of the royal family, and her people had caused so much pain and suffering for the humans. He had lost friends, comrades in arms, because of people like her. She had fought against the humans, led the Zalari forces on numerous raids. She was responsible for so much death. And yet, in the moment when she needed help, Aaron hadn't hesitated. He had chosen to save her. But why? Why had he saved her? Was it because she was a woman, injured and alone? Was it because of some deep moral compass that refused to let him leave someone to die, even if they were the enemy? Or was it because, For a brief moment, he had seen her as a person, not an enemy. Those questions gnawed at him as he sat beside her, watching her breathe. He had no answers, and perhaps there were no simple answers. All he knew was that it was done, and now he had to deal with the consequences. Suddenly, Silara's eyes snapped open, and she gasped for breath. Aaron was quick to respond, leaning over her and checking her vitals. Her pulse had dropped, and her breathing was shallow. She was still in pain, and she wasn't fully conscious, but at least she had come back from the brink. "Easy, princess," Aaron murmured, adjusting her position to make her more comfortable. "You're safe now. Just breathe." Silara groaned, her voice hoarse. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Aaron repeated, trying to keep his tone calm. "You're at a temporary evac zone. We're in a safe place for now." Her eyes narrowed as she stared at him, and Aaron could feel the tension in the air. You saved me." Aaron nodded, careful to not show any emotion. "You were dying. I did what I had to do." She looked at him in disbelief. "Why? Why would you save me? You should have left me to die, human. My people, my father, will come for you." Aaron sighed, looking at the floor for a moment before meeting her gaze. "I didn't save you for your people or for your father. I saved you because it's what I do. I'm a medic. My job is to save lives, no matter who they belong to." Silara's eyes flashed with anger. "You think saving me is some act of kindness?" She spat, her voice trembling with pain and fury. "You think you're a hero?" Aaron shook his head, his voice steady. "I'm not a hero. I'm just doing my job. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to save you, and I didn't ask for any of this to happen. But I'm not going to apologize for doing the right thing." There was a long pause, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. Silara's gaze softened slightly, though there was still a hard edge in her eyes. She seemed to be weighing his words, trying to understand why a human, someone who was supposed to be her enemy, had chosen to save her. "I don't know what to think of you," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Aaron didn't answer, unsure of what she expected from him. The truth was, he didn't know what to think either. The war had stripped him of many things, his innocence, his sense of right and wrong, but when it came to saving lives, there was no question in his mind. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the walls, reminding him that the war was still very much alive. There was no time to think too much about their conversation. The battle raged on, and they were only in a temporary safe space. The danger was still real, and both of them knew it. But just as Aaron was about to check on the other wounded soldiers in the area, the door to the makeshift medical shelter opened, and a figure stepped inside. It was a Zalari soldier, a woman dressed in full combat gear. She eyed Aaron warily but focused on the princess. "Princess Silara," the soldier said, her voice firm and respectful. "Your father has sent word. We need to move you to the main ship immediately." Silara's eyes flicked toward the soldier, and then back to Aaron. There was a brief moment of silence. The tension in the room was palpable as Silara seemed to wrestle with her next words. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "I'm not leaving yet." The soldier looked uncertain but didn't push further. Instead, she turned and left the room, leaving the princess and Aaron alone again. Silara looked at Aaron, her gaze no longer filled with pure anger. There was something else in her eyes now, something that Aaron couldn't quite place. "You saved my life," she said again, her voice quieter this time, almost as if she was thinking aloud. "And now I owe you something, but I don't know what." Aaron glanced at her, feeling the weight of her words. "You don't owe me anything. I did what I had to do." She studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I may not be able to repay you, but I will never forget this. You have my word." Aaron nodded, not sure what else to say. The weight of the moment hung heavily between them, but the war was still raging outside. There was no time for words. They had both made decisions, his to save her, hers to survive. And in that moment, there was nothing more to do but wait for whatever came next. The hours following Silara's recovery were tense, filled with moments of silence and brief exchanges between Eren and the princess. Though she was alive and her injuries were stabilizing, the weight of the war and the consequences of her survival hung heavy in the air. As much as Eren wanted to focus solely on helping the wounded and keeping Silara safe, the world outside continued to tear itself apart. The sounds of gunfire, explosions, and distant cries of soldiers in battle were constant reminders that they were in the middle of a never-ending war. Eren stayed close to Silara, his eyes flicking to the door every few moments. He knew the situation was fragile. If the Zelari forces learned that he had saved their princess, things could spiral quickly. While the humans had always been at odds with the Zelari, this was something different. He wasn't just saving another soldier, he was saving someone who had led attacks against humanity, someone who had caused countless losses for his people. Despite the anger he felt toward her and her people, Eren couldn't deny that there was something about her, a certain strength, a certain resolve that kept her fighting, even when she was vulnerable. She wasn't like the other soldiers he'd seen on the battlefield. While others ran from danger, she had always charged straight into the fray. She had the kind of leadership that inspired loyalty in her people, and even if he didn't like her, he had to respect her for it. "Are you sure you don't want to go?" Eren asked, his voice steady, though he couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. Silara turned her head to look at him, her violet eyes narrowing. "I'm not leaving yet," she repeated, her voice firm. "You've saved me, but that doesn't mean I'm going to run back to my father like some fragile thing. I won't let the war define me. Not yet." Eren didn't argue. He knew that part of her had to be pride. It wasn't just about survival for her. It was about showing strength in the face of overwhelming odds. And while he didn't fully understand her reasons, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of respect for her determination. "But the war," Eren began, glancing toward the crumbling walls outside, "it's still going on. There's no telling how long this truce will last. You might be safer if you—" "I don't want to be safe," Silara interrupted, her voice sharp. "I want to fight. If I leave now, my people will think I'm weak. I can't let them see me like that." Her words struck Eren harder than he expected. He had been so focused on saving lives, on doing what he was trained to do, that he hadn't considered the mental and emotional toll this war must have on the people fighting it. Silara wasn't just a soldier. She was the daughter of a king, the leader of a rebellion. The weight on her shoulders was crushing. "You're not weak," Eren said quietly, his voice sincere. "You're still standing." Silara looked at him, her eyes softening for a moment. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, uncertainty, maybe even gratitude. But it was gone before Eren could make sense of it. "I won't let my people think I've abandoned them," she said, her voice a little quieter now. "But I'm not going to fight for the wrong reasons either. I can't blindly follow a cause that's doomed." The room fell silent again, save for the faint noises from outside. The calm was deceptive. Eren knew that at any moment, the world could erupt into chaos again. The war wasn't over. No matter how much they wanted to ignore it, the reality of the conflict would always be lurking in the background. And yet, in this tiny temporary safe zone, there was a strange feeling, something between exhaustion and something else. Eren couldn't quite name it, but it was as though he was standing on the edge of something much bigger. He had saved a princess, but the act had not come without consequences. What would happen next? Would the Zelari reward him for his actions, or would they come for him as an enemy? What would Silara do now that she owed him a life? And what about his own people? The questions were endless, and there were no clear answers. But one thing was for sure: this moment was bigger than any of them. Silara had survived, and Eren had played a part in that. They were now linked, whether they liked it or not. The rest of the war would have to wait. As Silara began to sit up, Eren helped her adjust, his hand steadying her as she moved. She winced slightly from the pain, but it didn't stop her from trying to regain her strength. She was a warrior, after all. "You're still too weak to move," Aaron said gently, trying to ease her back down. "Rest for a while. You've been through a lot." "I don't have time to rest," Silara replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that clearly weighed on her. "I need to find out what's happening. The war is bigger than just me, Aaron. It's not something I can ignore." "You can't fight if you're not strong enough to stand," he responded, his tone firm. "You need to recover first." Silara didn't answer right away, her eyes focused on the distant sounds of battle. She seemed lost in thought, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. The silence between them grew long as she thought over everything that had happened. She had been fighting for so long, leading troops, inspiring others to rise up against humanity. But now, after everything she had been through, after the chaos and destruction, she was beginning to question her own motivations. Had she been fighting for the right reasons all along? And then a thought crossed her mind. Aaron, the human medic who had saved her life. What did it mean? She had been raised to see humans as enemies, as threats to her people. But in this moment, he had proven to her that not all humans were the same. Not all of them wanted to destroy her. "I don't understand you," Silara muttered, more to herself than to him. "You should hate me. You should want me dead. My people have killed so many of your own." Aaron met her gaze, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not here to hate you. I'm here to save lives. That's all I can do." Silara looked at him, her eyes searching his face as though looking for a hidden meaning behind his words. She couldn't figure him out. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had defied everything she had been taught. He was just a medic, a soldier like all the others. But there was something different about him. "You don't know what it's like," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. "To be caught between two sides, to be forced to choose between duty and your own beliefs." Aaron hesitated before speaking. "I don't. But I do know what it's like to fight for something you believe in." For a moment, Silara said nothing. She just stared at him, as though trying to read him. And then, finally, she spoke. "Maybe you do. But this war is bigger than either of us. It's bigger than you or me or even my father. There's no end to it. Just pain, loss, and bloodshed." Aaron nodded, his expression somber. "I know, but that's why I keep going. There has to be something worth fighting for. Otherwise, what's the point?" Silara looked away, her mind lost in the weight of their conversation. She had been so focused on the war, on her own struggle for survival, that she had never stopped to think about the bigger picture. Maybe Aaron was right. Maybe there was something worth fighting for after all. The silence stretched on, each of them lost in their thoughts. For the first time, they were not just enemy and ally, but two people caught in the same whirlwind of chaos, trying to make sense of a world that seemed to have no answers. The war would continue. The conflict between humans and Salari would rage on. But for now, Aaron and Silara had something more important to deal with: survival and the strange bond that had formed between them in the midst of the battlefield. They were no longer just enemies. They were two people who had seen the horrors of war, and perhaps for the first time, they were beginning to understand each other. The days passed, and the war outside raged on. The distant sounds of explosions and gunfire were a constant reminder of the violence that still gripped the world. But in this small corner of the battlefield, things were different. Inside the makeshift medical shelter, Silara and Aaron were forced to coexist, the delicate balance between enemy and ally hanging in the air. There were no answers, no easy solutions, just the harsh reality of the situation they were in. Aaron kept his distance, allowing Silara the space she needed to recover, but he was always close by, ready to help if she needed it. She was getting stronger by the day, her wounds slowly healing, but there was something else, something deeper, that still lingered in her eyes. She was not the same woman who had been unconscious and near death in his care. Now she was more alert, her mind constantly working, weighing the choices she had to make. The princess wasn't one to sit idly by. Even in her weakened state, she still had a fire in her eyes. She wasn't just recovering, she was planning. Aaron could see it in the way she would stare out of the makeshift window at the distant horizon. She wasn't just thinking about the battle. She was thinking about her people, her future, and her father's expectations. Solara had always been a leader, and even now, in the face of her own vulnerability, she was plotting her next move. One afternoon, as Aaron was tending to another injured soldier, Solara approached him. She moved slowly, her face still pale but determined. Her eyes met his with a quiet intensity, and for a moment, Aaron wondered if she had come to ask him to help her escape or to join her in some mission. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew whatever it was, it would change everything. "Aaron," she said, her voice steady, though there was an undercurrent of something darker in it. "I need to talk to you." Aaron looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a cloth. "What's on your mind, princess?" Solara didn't respond to the slight sarcasm in his voice. Instead, she stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "I've been thinking about what you said, about fighting for something worth fighting for." Aaron raised an eyebrow. And I think you're right. This war, it doesn't have to be endless. But we're stuck in it. We're all stuck." Her voice grew softer, almost as if she was speaking more to herself than to him. "I've been fighting for my father, for the Zalari cause, for revenge. But it's not enough anymore. I need to know if there's a way out. A way to end this." Aaron sighed, his eyes thoughtful as he met her gaze. "Ending the war isn't something either of us can do alone. It's not that simple. The sides are too divided, the stakes too high." "I know," she replied, "but I can't keep fighting like this. I can't keep going to war for reasons that don't make sense to me anymore. My father, the Zalari leaders, they want to win at all costs, even if it means endless destruction. But there has to be another way." Aaron considered her words carefully. It wasn't the first time he had heard someone question the war, but it was rare for someone on the opposing side to say it so openly. Solara's people had been waging this conflict for years, and for her to admit the futility of it, to question her loyalty, was a significant shift in her thinking. "But if you back down, if you stop fighting, won't your people see it as weakness?" Aaron asked, trying to understand her perspective. Solara's eyes darkened, but there was no anger in them. Instead, there was a quiet sadness. "They already think I'm weak. I've failed them in so many ways. I've led them into battle, caused death, and lost so many of my people. How many more will die before this ends? I can't keep pretending that what we're doing is right." Aaron studied her for a moment, recognizing the weight in her words. She had always been a leader, always the one people looked to for strength. But now, she was questioning that strength, searching for something more, something meaningful. "You're not alone in this, Solara," he said quietly, his voice surprisingly gentle. "There are people on both sides of this war who are tired of fighting. Maybe it's not hopeless." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "I've seen it," Aaron continued. "I've treated soldiers on both sides. We're all tired. Tired of the killing, the loss. It's easy to think that we have to win at any cost, that the war is everything. But the truth is, it doesn't solve anything. It just leaves us with more bodies to bury." Solara's gaze softened for a moment, her shoulders slumping slightly as though the weight of the words had finally hit her. "But how do we stop it? How do we make the fighting end?" "I don't know," Aaron admitted. "But maybe it starts with people like us. People who can see past the hatred, who can find common ground. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But if enough people are willing to lay down their weapons, if enough people can say enough, maybe we can change things." Solara's eyes glinted with something like hope, a faint trace of it flickering behind the weight of her doubts. "And if I do that, if I try to end this, what will happen to me? To my people?" Aaron shook his head, unsure of what to say. I can't promise you anything. The world is messy, and it's complicated. You're not just a soldier, you're a symbol. Your actions will have consequences, but you don't have to fight for the wrong reasons anymore. You don't have to let your father's war be your war. She thought about that for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge of the table she stood beside. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter now. You've given me a lot to think about. I don't know what I'll do yet, but you're right about one thing. She looked up at him, her gaze steady and sincere. I can't keep fighting for a cause I no longer believe in. Aaron gave her a small nod. It's not easy, but you have to find your own way, Solara. We all do. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The noise from the battlefield outside seemed distant now, almost as if it belonged to another world entirely. Inside the shelter, there was only silence, heavy, uncertain, but oddly peaceful. Suddenly, the door to the shelter burst open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was one of the Zalari soldiers who had been stationed outside, his face grim as he stepped into the room. His eyes quickly found Solara, and his expression softened slightly, though it was clear he was here on business. Princess Solara, the soldier said with respect, though there was a hint of urgency in his voice. Your father has sent for you. The council has made a decision. You must return to the capital at once. Solara's heart sank, and she exchanged a glance with Aaron. She had known this moment would come. There was no escaping it. Her father's will would not be ignored, and there was no running from the expectations that came with being the daughter of the Zalari king. I understand, she said quietly, her voice resolute but heavy with the weight of what she knew she had to do. The soldier nodded and stepped back to allow her space. We'll leave immediately. Your father has ordered preparations for your return. Solara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. She had come so far, had questioned so much, and yet now she was being pulled back into the very world she had been trying to escape. She wasn't ready to go. She wasn't ready to face her father or the responsibility that awaited her. But there was no choice. As Solara gathered her things, ready to leave, Aaron watched her with a mixture of concern and respect. He had hoped she would find another way, but he knew the forces at play were too great. She had made her choice. The war was far from over, and now they were both back on the same path they had been on before. The question was, what would happen next? Would Solara find the strength to do what was right, or would she return to the battlefield, caught up in the very war she had started to question? Only time would tell. The journey back to the Zalari capital was long, filled with tension and uncertainty. Solara had been silent for most of the trip, her thoughts constantly swirling in her mind. She had wanted to stay with Aaron, to figure out how she could help end the war. But now she was being dragged back to her father's side, to face the king's wrath and the council's expectations. She couldn't help but feel trapped, caught between two worlds she no longer understood. As the transport ship soared through the atmosphere, the city below grew closer and closer. The towering spires of the Zalari capital city gleamed in the sunlight, casting long shadows across the barren land surrounding it. It was a city built on power, wealth, and war. Every corner of it spoke of dominance and strength. The city had been a symbol of the Zalari people's pride, a place where the king's rule was absolute. But to Solara, it had become a symbol of everything she no longer believed in. The ship's engines hummed steadily as they entered the city's atmosphere. Solara couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change again, that everything she had known and believed in was about to collapse. The guilt she had carried with her since the moment she had questioned the war was growing heavier by the minute. She wasn't sure what her father would do when she returned, but she was certain that her absence from the front lines hadn't gone unnoticed. She glanced out of the window at the sprawling city below, the grand palaces and military complexes that lined the horizon. There was no escaping it. She had been born into this world, and no matter how much she wanted to break free, she couldn't change her bloodline. Her father, King Ralzar, was a powerful ruler. He would not tolerate weakness or defiance, and he would see her questioning of the war as a betrayal. Silara, the soldier next to her, spoke, pulling her from her thoughts. It was one of her father's trusted men, his face hard and unreadable. "We're almost there. You should prepare yourself. The king is not known for his patience." Silara nodded but didn't respond. She had already prepared herself for the worst. She knew what awaited her. It wasn't just the king she had to worry about. It was the council, the generals, and the other leaders who would question her loyalty. They would all demand answers, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to give them the answers they wanted. As the ship descended toward the palace, the feeling of dread in Silara's chest grew. She had always admired her father's strength, his ability to command respect and fear from his people. But now she was no longer sure she admired him. She wasn't sure she could follow his orders anymore, not when she knew the cost of his actions. The ship finally landed, its engines cutting off with a low hum. The soldiers disembarked first, followed by Silara. She stepped off the ship, her heart pounding in her chest. She was home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. She walked through the grand gates of the palace, her footsteps echoing in the cold stone hallways. The palace was eerily quiet, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for her return, waiting for the reckoning that was sure to come. As they walked through the corridors, Silara couldn't help but feel the weight of her father's gaze, even though he wasn't there. His influence seemed to hang over every part of the palace, every room, every hallway. It was a constant reminder of his power. Finally, they reached the throne room. The doors were massive, made of dark metal and adorned with the royal insignia. As the doors swung open, Silara stepped inside, her eyes immediately locking with her father's. King Ralzar sat on his throne, his posture regal and commanding. His eyes were cold and calculating, studying her every move. Silara stood before him, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. She had always admired her father's strength, but now, standing before him, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. She knew that whatever happened next would define the rest of her life. "Silara," King Ralzar's voice rang out, deep and commanding. "You returned to me at last. I trust you have completed your mission, that you have not abandoned your duties." Silara took a deep breath, her heart racing. She had to be careful with her words. One wrong move, one wrong phrase, and it could all be over. "Father," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I have not abandoned my duties, but I can no longer fight this war. I have seen the destruction it causes, the endless cycle of violence. I cannot continue to lead our people into battle for a cause I no longer believe in." There was a long silence in the throne room as King Ralzar considered her words. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Silara wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Her father had always valued loyalty above all else. To question his leadership, to question the war, was unthinkable. But the truth was, she couldn't keep pretending that she believed in the cause. "You dare speak to me like this?" King Ralzar's voice was a low growl, filled with anger. "You would abandon your people, your father, for the sake of some misguided ideal. Do you know what this war has cost us? The lives we've lost, the resources we've given, the victories we've claimed. And you want to stop it all now? Do you think your people will follow you if you turn your back on them?" Silara stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "I am not turning my back on them, Father. I am trying to save them. This war is not a victory. It's a tragedy. We have killed so many, and for what? To prove we are stronger. To prove we are right. It's not enough anymore." King Ralzar's expression grew darker, his fists clenched around the arms of his throne. "You are naive, Silara. You always have been. This war is not about right or wrong. It's about survival. It's about the future of our people. The humans will never stop fighting us. They will never back down. And if you abandon this fight, you are betraying everything we have worked for." Silara's heart ached. She had always known her father to be ruthless. But now, hearing his words, she realized just how deep his belief in the war ran. It wasn't just a strategy for him. It was everything. It was his identity, his legacy, and to walk away from it was to walk away from him.